Welcome to the Book of Exodus series on the Town and Field Church podcast. In this 40-day series, one of us at Town and Field will be taking a quick look at one of the chapters of Exodus and sharing some ideas around the text. To learn more about this reading plan and podcast, visit townandfield.ca/reading plans. Now enjoy today's episode.
Hey, this is Ryan, and I get to take a look at chapter 1 of Exodus today, and I'm really excited. Thank you so much for joining in on this reading plan and for checking out this podcast. There's a lot that could be said about Exodus chapter 1, but I want to just highlight a couple things. So to lay the setting, hopefully you've read it, but what happens is that time has passed since the end of Genesis. At the end of Genesis, Jacob and his family, all of Israel, they've traveled to Egypt to be safe there and to have food and to live there in the land of Goshen. But what happens when we open up Exodus chapter 1 is we realize, well, there's this new king. It's called a pharaoh. It's an ancient Egyptian word for a king, just a generic name. He's in power, and he doesn't remember Joseph and his family. He doesn't have that connection. And what he sees is he sees a bunch of people who aren't Egyptians, and he starts to think, what if these guys become a big nation and take over? And what if they kind of mess up my control and power here? Sort of his insecurity, he starts to think, I need to do something to maintain control, to be the man in charge. So as Pharaoh decides to take some pretty nasty steps in Exodus chapter 1. But there's some pretty cool things that happen here. Right at the start of chapter 1 in verse 1, I want to read this to you. It says, these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob. The words Israel and Jacob, the names are used interchangeably here. Now, if you remember in Genesis, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And it's this reflection of this covenant that God made with Abraham. Remember, God made this covenant with Abraham. He said, I'm going to make you the father of many nations. A great nation is going to come out of you. And there's going to be this great work coming out of it. And this is the author drawing our minds back to that covenant and reminding us that God is sovereign, He's powerful, and He is still at work in this. And then in verse 11, we see that Pharaoh started to enslave and oppress the Israelites. We think, oh no, but if we think back to Genesis 15:13, I'm going to read that to you really quickly. When God's making His covenant with Abraham, He says to Abraham, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. It's so fascinating. We see that God had said this is going to happen, and He's continuing to work out His plan. And He continues to work out His plan and His will in a pretty interesting way, because Pharaoh starts to enslave the people. But what happens is we see in chapter 1 here that they continue to spread and increase. The Israelites are becoming a lot. And so Pharaoh's like, oh man, this plan isn't working. What are we going to do? We need plan B. So he comes up with this insane plan. He says, I know, I'm going to kill all the boys. He's like, if I kill the sons of Israel, if I kill all the Hebrew sons, they'll be powerless. They won't be able to partner with one of my enemies. They won't be able to rise up. They won't be able to wreck us. Well, it's pretty ironic because he decided, I'm going to snuff out the boys, but what we see for the rest of the chapter and the narrative moving forward is that it's actually some of the women who start to unfurl his plan. So we see these two Hebrew midwives show up named Shiphrah and Puah. So interesting that they're named. This is intentional. The author doesn't even name Pharaoh. Pharaoh doesn't have a name. It's just like, yeah, some king, some Pharaoh shows up. But he names these two women. And what do these women do? Pharaoh says, I want you to kill all the Hebrew boys when they're born. Well, they decide not to. And Pharaoh gets upset and they tell him, like, the Hebrew women are just like, the babies come out too quickly. We can't do it. Now, some people wonder, well, are they lying to Pharaoh or are they not? We don't know. Maybe the Hebrew women literally were better at popping out babies quickly than the Egyptian women were. But what we see here, and the important thing is this, is that God is working in a powerful way through these two women who choose to fear God rather than fear the Pharaoh, who choose to trust God's provision rather than trusting Pharaoh's dominance and power. And they decide to act in a way that's righteous and just. And because of that, they start to unfurl Pharaoh's plan, and they become part of God's great and divine plan to maintain His covenant to all of Israel. And they provide an example for us to always choose to fear God rather than to fear the Pharaoh. So as we walk today, as we think about Exodus 1, let us ask ourselves, are we walking in a way that trusts God, or are we walking in a way that trusts other things that this world would call us to trust?